Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm very happy to be making the introductory remarks to still another event of our new Global Energy Center. And it's a particular pleasure for me today to introduce our speaker, Melanie Kenderdine, who is the Director of the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, as well as counselor to the Secretary. Melanie, of course, has had a long career in government, working now, of course, with Secretary Moniz, but prior to that, she was the executive director of the MIT Energy Initiative, I guess working with Secretary Moniz at that time. And she's been vice president of the Washington operations for the Gas Technology Institute. And served in the Clinton administration in various positions at the Department of Energy. She joins us to talk as much as she can about the Quadrennial Energy Review. We had hoped it might have been released by now, but it will be released later this month. But as many of you know, the Quadrennial Energy Review is designed to help the federal government better meet the nation's energy goals. This year's report has a particular focus on energy infrastructure, as well as U.S. energy and climate security considerations. And significantly, it will translate our energy policy goals into a set of, hopefully anyway, into a set of integrated actions through improved interagency dialogue, which is always a challenge, and increased engagement of external stakeholders. Also on behalf of the Council, Melanie has been involved in these issues for so long, and we want to thank you for your tireless work on both domestic and global energy issues, and for giving us at least some kind of preview of what to expect. For the audience and those watching the live webcast, you can contribute to the conversation on Twitter by utilizing hashtag ACEnergy. And so the way it'll work this morning, Melanie will provide brief remarks, and it's going to be followed by a Q&A session moderated by Annie Medaglia, who I want to particularly welcome as our new Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center. Many of you probably know Annie from her work both with me back in the State Department when I was Special Envoy for Eurasian Energy, and then in the Energy Resources Bureau. So Annie will be handling that part of it. And now, without anything further, I'd like to welcome Ms. Melanie Kenderdine.
Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar. I had hoped that the QER would be done at this point in time. It is. Let me explain the process. QER is run by the White House. It is co-chaired by John Holdren and Dan Utek, and it is a massive interagency effort. And our role in the QER is to help manage the interagency process. We have the Secretariat, and the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office provides the analytical support. And I would like to introduce a couple of members of my staff. Karen Wayland. Karen is the Deputy Director for State and Local and Tribal Outreach. Karen has, as part of the QER effort, organized all of the stakeholder outreach meetings. That's another thing that we do at the Department of Energy for the QER. We've had 14 stakeholder outreach meetings across the country. Those are both geographically and topically diverse, and just putting those together was an enormous undertaking. We received great input from stakeholders everywhere. A few of them are in the room. And Greg Gershuni, my chief of staff, who has worked as hard as he can to keep me sane and keep the trains running on. He's failed miserably. And so there are, I think, about 20 agencies that are involved in this process. And so, and that reflects the enormous equities that that many agencies have in energy. It is very cross-cutting. That structure was recommended by President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in, I think, November of 2010. Coincidentally, Secretary Moniz was then Professor Moniz and recommended that we establish a quadrennial energy review as part of that PCAST report. And I apologize to those of you who've heard this before, but he said he was actually there to throw the football and then caught it on the other side. And they also recommended that they set up an energy policy and systems analysis office at the Department of Energy. When the secretary came in, that is exactly what he did. And what we have done is put together a team of 50 or so analysts who have been, that's not their only job, doing the analytical work for the QER, but many of us have been working for some time on the analysis to support the QER. Because it's not out yet, I can only talk about some of our findings. Certainly can't talk about the recommendations because right now a few of those aren't finalized yet. But I would say that there will be a significant body of recommendations in the QER. And I talked to the secretary last night. As you all know, he is in Switzerland, and he called me about 9:30 our time, and I asked him, "What are you doing up?" And he said they were working all night. And so he did say that he is testifying, as you might also know, on April 28th before the Senate Energy Committee, and he expects to have a finalized QER when he testifies before Senate Energy. So that tells you what our lives are like right now. We don't have a lot of time to finalize this. And so, and this was, the QER was established by a presidential memorandum January 9th, 2014. The president did instruct the people involved in the QER to focus on energy infrastructure. I have a task force of the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board, and they recommended that we narrow that further. And so what we have been doing is looking at transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure, and that is the infrastructure that links energy supplies, carriers, or byproducts to intermediate or end users or waste disposal sites. And I won't go into more on that. You can see there in this cute little slide that I did at the beginning, year one, as I said, we're focusing on TS&D. We have not selected the topic for year two. That is a White House decision, and probably a day after we get this done, we're going to need to start on QER 2. Hopefully we can have a little time off before then. We can focus on supply and in-use infrastructure, which makes sense since we focus on TS&D, but electricity, just end use, there are a lot of options that we are discussing right now. This QER, we have taken an integrated approach, and we are not doing stovepipe, typical liquid fuels, natural gas grid. Okay, as you get in a conventional analysis of this sort, we have focused on, and these are analytically derived objectives through our analysis, and ultimately decided to go this way. The first is the increased resilience, reliability, safety, and asset security. That is asset security as opposed to energy security. That's the physical security of your assets, okay? So I want to make that clear. A transition to a low-carbon grid of the future, that is the one a discrete physical infrastructure that we decided to focus on because it supports all other infrastructures. And so electricity was deemed to be so important that we have focused on that. An objective of modernizing our global energy infrastructures. Those are both physical and geopolitical infrastructures. And largely, when I say that, I mean the G7 collective broader definition of energy security is something that we focused on some. And then improving shared infrastructures. That is something that I know a lot of you all have been thinking about and dealing with, but that is rail, barge, truck, et cetera, et cetera. As Ambassador Morningstar mentioned, I worked in the Clinton administration. I did not know that I would have to become an expert on rail when I came back in here. That wasn't something we focused on in the 90s, but it's a big issue now. Just a little on increased energy infrastructure resilience, the first objective there. And this is a divider slide, but I would note that this is a photo of rail kink. And rail kink, another thing that I've become expert on, and with an 80-degree temperature difference, an 1,800-foot section of rail can expand by 12 inches. There have been derailments. They have heat warnings because of this. And when you see increased temperatures, you're going to see increased rail kink. And you have similar problems in the winter with severe weather. And I think that one of the accidents, the one in West Virginia, I think might have been related to the cold weather, the recent one. I don't think they finally decided that. That was one of the initial comments. This is some things, some of our findings. Obviously, extreme weather events are increasing. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. Those are exacerbated by climate change. We did regional fuel resiliency studies, looking at regions by PAD for fuels. And one of the conclusions, the SPR is not a good tool for dealing with regional fuel issues because you need product, not crude oil, and it takes 20 days to move oil out of the SPR. But as weather events increase out in regions and you have additional issues, we are looking at options for how to deal with that. Cyber attacks on infrastructure are increasing. This is for 2013 numbers. 53% of all cyber attacks on infrastructure were on energy installations. This is that pie chart, okay? And so that is, you have one other in double digits. That's critical manufacturing, and all the rest are in single digits. So clearly, energy installations are a target and cyber incidents. Our energy infrastructure is aging. That is because there was huge expansion post-World War II. That's what you're seeing now in both electricity and natural gas infrastructures. A couple of key points as we look at solutions. It's very difficult to rate base pre-disaster mitigation because many of these utilities cross state borders, et cetera, but you want to do pre-disaster hardening of your infrastructure because it's far less expensive and you're modernizing at the same time. And but it's very difficult to do. We need to look at improving how we do that. And studies we looked at, this is not specific to energy, but pre-disaster hardening of infrastructures in general gets you a 4-to-1 return on investment. I said I'd say a little bit more about increases in weather-related disasters. There were 11 individual weather disasters costing $1 billion or more in 2012. That is second only to 2011 for the most on record. 2013 insurance data, this isn't just for energy either, but for all losses is $22 billion just for 1 year. That doesn't account self-insurance, so that's just for insured losses. And this is from the Council of Economic Advisors for a 5-year period from 2008 to 2012. This is for electricity, specifically weather-related power outages. the costs of those range from 107 million to 107 billion to 202 billion. I think I just found a typo in the QER. Billion versus million. I need to go look at that. This is an interesting slide. I know it doesn't tell you much at all. That little yellow circle in the middle is Cushing, where in Cushing, Oklahoma, where we store a whole lot of oil. And the blue lines are recorded tornado paths. And yes, and so it says a lot when you actually know what it is. And what we have heard is that it is not a question of whether it will be hit. At some point, it will be hit. And a lot of work has been done on hardening those facilities. But it is, I think, 10 to 15% of our oil gets stored there at some point in time. And don't quote me on that. I am probably misremembering, but it is a significant storage point for oil, and I think that the slide kind of says it all. Gulf Coast hurricanes are another problem. We have looked at sea level rise and inundation and storm surge. This is a depiction of all of the energy infrastructure that is in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see the numbers. There are 42 refineries, 86 gas processing plants, 31% of our national gas processing is in this region, and 35% of our national propane stocks. 52% of our refining capacity is in this region. And so when you have hurricanes and with increasing intensity and additional storm surge, it not only affects this region, it affects the rest of the country in a pretty significant way. And just from hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we lost 4.5 million barrels a day. I think 20 refineries went down on the worst day. That was 67% of the Gulf's capacity. We had lost 1 million barrels a day for over 2 months. I did not realize that when I started working on the QER. That's a lot of oil to lose for a long period of time. We did use the SPR in that instance, but again, it's crude oil. We needed refined product. IEA, in a concerted action, sent us refined product. We put crude oil onto the market, and took 20 days for the crude oil to move, and delivering any of that product to the Southeast proved to be difficult. And you saw significant price spikes in the Southeast when that happened. This is some indication of some of the issues we're seeing. This is the importance of transmission infrastructure. This is gas transmission. And what you see here are, these are price differentials for the various price points, trading points across the United States. And the middle there where you see a broad range that's 2007. And what you've seen, we attributed this largely to shale gas and adequate infrastructure keeping up with that shale gas production. You see enormous narrowing of your differentials down there at the end, except for New York and New England, where they are infrastructure constrained. It has impacts on electricity prices. I'll show you that in a minute. One other thing I would say about this is investment in storage is incentivized by price differentials, and so with the narrowing of price differentials, we haven't looked at it in detail. We would like to see what the impacts might be on the economics of storage going forward with that narrowing of price differentials. This is leaking local distribution pipes, natural gas distribution pipes. And the left is Indianapolis, the right is Boston, the yellow is methane leaks. These are old bare steel and cast iron pipes. One thing I would say about this, Indianapolis instituted a replacement program after a gas explosion at the local utility in the 1980s. And to Massachusetts' credit, they have proactively acted, and in 2009 launched a program to replace their local distribution pipelines. And but you can see the difference there is pretty significant. We have had a major focus on this. It is not only a environmental issue, it's a safety issue, and we have seen convergence of interest of the LDCs, the distribution companies, labor unions who want to replace these pipes, and the environmentalists who want to reduce emissions. And it's rare when you see that kind of agreement, all for different reasons, but we are hopeful, and we'll have recommendations in that regard. This is moving to transition to a low-carbon grid of the future. I'm going to start out with one of my probably several unreadable slides in here. Look at the lower left-hand corner, the map in the lower left-hand corner. Those are the jurisdictions for our RTOs and ISOs. And you see, California, the West, that big green section. That's a region. Then look over at the bottom right. Those are the regions that the NEMS model for EIA uses to model the system. And what I can say is that they're not even close. And so to some degree, these jurisdictional issues are in no way, shape, or form tracking how electrons actually flow and work. And it does create, it's creating a situation where it is more difficult for us to take full advantage of a lot of the technologies that we have and can deploy because of those the jurisdictional differences. And technologies like distributed generation, valuing efficiency, et cetera, are more difficult to maximize their value when you have those kinds of disconnects between jurisdictions and how the modeling and how electrons flow. So there is a fair amount of discussion in the QER in that regard. We are in no way, shape, or form recommending that we change boundaries, but we do have to do an enormous amount of work in coordination and working together in order to fully maximize and value all of these new technologies that we have and are developing. Some key trends in electricity. Seeing low to negative load growth. That's has a lot of implications for business models. The cost of maintenance is growing. There's a discussion in the QER on that, and how much money is actually being spent just to maintain existing systems, not expand new ones. Increased use of distributed generation. That's raising a lot of issues like net metering. I'm sure you all are familiar with those. I already mentioned weather-related disturbances. Those are increasing. Investments in resilience have multiple benefits. Fair amount of discussion on that and recommendations in that regard. A lot of lack of information throughout this document. I'll talk a little bit more about that in shared infrastructure, but we really need to step up our game on information and tools and modeling. And state regional reliability renewable portfolio standards and efficiency standards could influence infrastructure needs. One of our models, this is just a model, looked at the need in 2030 for long-distance transmission beyond business as usual. And what we saw in that model is because of the generation of indigenous renewables closer. They're not as high quality, but there's a lot. Renewables are widely distributed. You may need less long-distance transmission, more short transmission lines, and more distributed energy. That could be a less expensive way to go than to move high-quality renewable resources over long-distance transmission. We certainly believe that there is a role for both. There are 17 states that either require the use of indigenous renewables in their renewable portfolio standards or incentivize it. So we haven't looked at that in detail. We would like to analyze and see what impact that has going forward. I can't see what that says. Hold on. the rate of growth in electricity demand has fallen each year since 2010. You can see that. And another important point, weather accounted for the vast majority of customer interruption hours. The other thing you see is equipment failure. Left, the blue bar is weather. The right is equipment operational issues. And the graph on the far right is customer hours lost. There's no customer hours that have been lost to cyber attacks, for instance. It's almost all weather and a few operational issues. But we need to be concerned about cyber. See a lot of regional variation in electricity prices. I mentioned that with the infrastructure constraints in the Northeast. The dark areas are high prices. Fundamentally, I do not know California. I have suspect reasons why. I don't know, and we did not analyze that I know of, why that swath from New Mexico and Colorado has high prices, and it's something worth looking at. So, but there is a lot of variation, and some of this is a reflection of infrastructure constraints, as we see in New England. Investment drivers. This is a survey of IOUs, co-ops, munis, state and federal power agencies, and ISOs, RTOs, and merchant developers. And it's a survey of what is driving their investment. And you can see the biggest slice of that pie is reliability. Second largest, I think, is encouraging is renewables integration. And so that's driving investment and important for transitioning to a clean energy future. This is U.S. GDP growth and the percent change of greenhouse gas emissions from 1992 to 2012. And what you see, green is GDP growth, and blue is percent change in greenhouse gas emissions. And you see very good news over there in 2011, 2012, where you have GDP growth and you also have reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. In 2008 and 2009, you see a significant decline in greenhouse gas emissions, but also in GDP growth. And so you can have GDP growth and reduce your or greenhouse gas emissions. And so I'm going to skip over the next slide. It's just projects that we've done, licensing presidential permits, cross-border electricity. And I'm going to move to modernizing global energy infrastructures. This is an interesting slide, and it says a lot of things, but the upper left-hand corner is 2010, and those little red dots are oil rail loading facilities. The lower right-hand corner is 2013, so that's only 3 years later, and the red dots are oil rail loading facilities. You also see they're hard to see, yes, they're hard to see, their little green triangles on there. Those are oil barge loading facilities in 2013. You don't see any of those in 2010. And what this says to me, knowing kind of the history of oil flows in the United States, significant change in oil flows. Our oil flows used to go from refineries in the Gulf, from the Gulf Coast up to refineries in the Midwest. The refineries in the Midwest don't need that Gulf Coast oil anymore. They're getting it from the Bakken and from Canada. And so it is a major reflection in changes in oil flows, because it's now going from north to south, and to some degree from west to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a change in modes. This is obviously rail traffic, as I mentioned, not something that I had thought about much before. And it says something about congestion in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico, and that is of particular concern to us because that is where our Strategic Petroleum Reserve is, and it's using the SPR uses a lot of the same infrastructure and systems that the commercial industry does, and we did a test sale in I don't know, a year ago maybe. We did a test sale of 5 million barrels just to test the system. We're authorized to do that. We did find some problems, okay, some issues, and it's not that we can't, we cannot, we can distribute significant amounts of SPR oil on a daily basis. The issue becomes how much of that oil is incremental oil, as opposed to, so you're not shutting in your own production. When you put SPR oil onto that system, you're actually moving incremental barrels of oil into the market. And so we've done a fair amount of work looking at that. I mentioned that we have done regional fuel resiliency studies. We already had a Northeast home heating oil reserve. I worked on that when I was in the Clinton administration. We set that up in 2000. We have also set up a gasoline reserve in the Northeast. You can see the locations there: New York, Boston, South Portland, and I think it's New Jersey, actually. Could be another typo in the QER, or this is old. But the point is, you have 1 million barrels of diesel. That's your home heating oil reserve. You have 1 million barrels of gasoline. They operate under different authorities. The gasoline reserve operates under the SPR authorities. The diesel reserve operates under a separate law that was established. If you wanted to use both of them, as you could have used them in Hurricane Sandy, there are different findings and requirements for their joint use. And so we have looked at that issue and its impacts. U.S. LPG export markets are growing significantly. There was less than 100,000 barrels per day. That's in late 2011. That's over 600K today. I think it's gone up even since then. This slide's about 6 months old. It is a significant and growing market for the United States. You can look right there. That is the difference between the U.S. Gulf propane prices versus the Saudi contract price. And we can take advantage of that difference, and we are. And so it's an important export market opportunity for us. So moving on to improving shared energy infrastructures. This is another divider slide, but I think it's amazing. This is the movement of the world's longest wind turbine blade. And you can see that it is pretty difficult to move those blades around. They have to be in one piece because they need to be in one piece in order to withstand the force. And so that is 83 meters long, I believe. It is the largest, as I said, this is in Scotland, I believe, where they are moving it. But in the 1980s, wind turbine blades were 5 to 15 meters long, and they're now typically 38 to 50 meters long. Some of them are 60 meters long. That's 180 feet. And it becomes a transportation issue. What is it doing to, and we are importing them. I think 40% of them come through Houston. They have to move then into Texas, the rest of Texas and around the country. And so movement of these is problematic. The nacelles for new turbines can weigh as much as 80 tons. And a tower section is 30 meters long and weighs 150,000 pounds. And so I know that they have redesigned some ship hulls in order to move these parts, and we have a lot of transportation issues. These affect state and local governments. A lot of logistical issues required moving these around. So it is it becomes a multimodal transportation issue. These are improved shared infrastructure trends, intermodal trends. In 1 year, 2011 to 2012, truck shipments of crude oil increased by 53%, rail 423%, barge 38%. The left-hand graph there in 2006 4,600 terminated carloads of crude oil. In 2013, 435,000. The EIA just put out numbers today, a 20-fold increase in crude by rail since 2010. And we all know about the safety issues the issues that we have been having with that. DOE has been working with the Department of Transportation, both doing research on oil volatility and rail cars, and we just put out a literature review as well discussing that issue. Another kind of impact of all of this increased oil and gas production in the United States is transporting large quantities of sand. They use sand in fracking, and Secretary and I were in North Dakota, huge piles of sand all over the place. And that's coming largely from the upper Midwest. One county in Wisconsin, its 2012 forecast said it's going from 137,000 tons 4 years earlier, transport of sand to 5 to 7 million tons. Sand is very heavy. It requires special rail cars for transport, and so it is another stressed infrastructure that I didn't think that I was going to have to worry about moving sand around the country when I came here before. This is, I mentioned crude by rail. This is an amazing slide. This is 2010, okay, and you can, the crude by rail movements, you can see them. Look at 2011, okay, not a huge difference in 2011. 2012, you start seeing an enormous amount of oil moving down to the Gulf of Mexico and more going east and west. 2013, look at the size of the bar going east. So you're moving a lot of Bakken oil to refineries in the on the East Coast. And then finally, look at how much we're moving in 2014 to the East Coast. That is in part a function of the difference in price between Bakken crude oil and Brent. Okay, and there is a benefit to doing this, and the East Coast refineries are beneficiaries of that. So, but it is an enormous change in just a few short years. This is something else on rail. The little map of the United States, that's coal-fired power plants supplied by the Powder River Basin. And 68% of coal used to generate electricity is delivered to power plants by rail. Approximately 40% of all coal in the United States is produced in Wyoming. The vast majority of that coal is sent to those 34 states, and 8 states obtain more than 90% of their domestic coal from the powder from Wyoming. And this raises a lot of this is occurring and happening at the same time you're seeing Bakken oil increase, rail transport of Bakken oil, and that's also where our agriculture, the bulk of our agricultural products are being produced and transported. That is largely by rail as well. So what you are seeing is a lot of competition for rail space. Agriculture is more problematic because it's seasonal. And oil is not. So the railroads like oil. It's not a seasonal product. And but this little box in the left-hand corner, this is from the United States Department of Agriculture, and it's a quote: "The magnitude and duration of recent unexpected shifts in supply and demand for rail service have exceeded previous events in terms of both magnitude and duration, including Hurricane Katrina, which caused major disruptions throughout the entire agricultural transportation network." So there are significant impacts of that congestion. This is another shared infrastructure that we have been looking at, ports and waterways. I was unaware of this. 2012, crude oil, refined petroleum products, and coal were 55% of all U.S. waterborne cargo traffic. Those numbers are higher I think it's 57% for inland waterways. This includes ports. That number includes all. I think it's 57% for inland waterways. Nearly 15% of all our petroleum products are shipped on inland waterways in the United States. We have the largest inland waterway system in the world by far. That's shared with Canada, and its maintenance is the waterborne part of that, and the ports is largely a federal responsibility, and we are trying to figure out ways to incentivize public-private partnerships in that regard. But as it stands now, certainly dredging up to a certain depth is a pure federal responsibility in ports. And what you see there, that cartoon, is Lake Charles, the Calcasieu Ship Channel. And the left is designed for two tankers to be passing each other, and the right is how it looks right now, because it needs to be dredged, and what you have to do is lighten your load. That affects the economics if you don't have a dredged channel. And some of the LNG exports that we are anticipating starting to happen in the very near future will be moving through that ship channel. And then I'm going to close here, just talk a little bit about North America. One of our QER meetings was held in Canada. The Canadians are very, very interested. We had a meeting up there with their stakeholders. We had a conference call with the Mexicans. We did not go down there. They were in the middle of changing their constitution, and had other things that they were worrying about at that point in time. But we did do a video conference with the Mexicans as well. These are the blue is crude oil, the red is refined product, green is natural gas, and purple is electricity. Canada exports about 10% of its electricity to the United States. That's hydro. We have discussed how we might be able to use Canadian hydro for storage for renewables on the U.S. side. I think 3 or 4 of our reliability regions, electric reliability regions in the U.S. are with Canada as well. They're shared. We have a shared border. Actually, I think these are. No, this is electricity trade. Sorry, our electricity trade. The graph down at the bottom. Our electricity trade with Canada is going up. Canadian imports to the U.S., Canadian exports from the U.S. are going down. And we have very little electricity trade with Mexicans. They would like to increase that. Interestingly enough, there were some operational issues in Texas. I think it was earlier this year, a year before, and the Mexicans did provide electricity over the border and kept the lights on in Texas as a result of that cooperation with the Mexicans. A summary of some key points on QER Canada. At our panels up in Ottawa, when we had a QER meeting up there, a couple of themes. Very interested in the need for enhancing public confidence in infrastructure. They have a lot of issues with that in Canada. A lot of infrastructure needs to cross the lands of Native peoples, and so we have similar issues down here, and then a tremendous need for better data. One area where I think we can see significant cooperation is in rail safety data, for example. They had a horrible accident, as you all know, in Canada, where 47 people were killed in a little town, and so they're very interested in working with us, and we are proceeding working with them on those kinds of things. Harmonizing data is essential to harmonizing regulation, and so the Secretary met with his counterparts in Mexico and Canada in December. They signed an MOU, and we are going to proceed with enhancing our cooperation in those areas. Sorry to be so expansive and data-driven, but that is exactly how the QER will read. And so thank you, and love to hear your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So obviously, this is an incredible undertaking, and it's going to require a lot of resources to implement. So I was wondering if you could kind of enlighten us on how we're actually going to accomplish that, and what type of maybe innovative public-private financing or market design is going to help us get there.
Well, we actually have been working at setting up an implementation team. Karen's office has been working on that for some time. What precisely needs to be implemented is not done yet because the QER is not done yet. There are a couple of things that were, I think 3 items in particular, that were in our FY16 budget request that we think are important. We've got to do a lot of program design on these. One is expanding and enhancing our state energy assurance plans. The ARA funding provided some funding for state energy assurance plans, and this is what we would like to do, is make that more consistent and robust, so that with targeting all 50 states, and that is to, and it won't be every year, but the states have energy assurance plans, they have contingency plans, they have curtailment plans. This is largely for how you manage resiliency and reliability in the event of emergencies. You need exercises, you need constant update of information, which is very labor intensive. And we would like to work with the states on that, and then good energy state assurance plans could be used as eligibility for other things in the department, and get other programs within the department, and get a really robust dialogue ongoing with the states on that. There are state electric reliability grants in the FY16 budget. You saw all of the issues that we are seeing with electricity reliability because of weather events. You also have issues not just with geomagnetic disturbances that are not weather related, and then concerns about physical attacks on the electric system. We had the one in Metcalf. I'm sure you all are familiar with that if you read the Wall Street Journal, and so there are a lot of reliability issues associated with the grid, and so we have a request for that in our FY16 budget. That is, we would like to encourage regional cooperation in that program, and we will be working on program design on that as well. And then we have at the department a cross-cutting grid modernization effort, which I don't know, it's $400 million. I don't know how much it is. $400 million. The request is thereabouts, and that's something else that I think is fairly directly related in our FY16 budget request to some of the things that we have in the QER. Some deferred maintenance for the SPR as well as is in the FY16 budget request. So those items are already there, and they will require the implementation and the attention of some of the people in our office. There is a whole range of additional recommendations that will require that as well, but as you know, I can't talk about the recommendations yet. So
wonderful, thanks. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll start, if you can use the microphone in the back, but yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
There's a microphone.
I had a question about the role of technology. Lots of the problems with the grid and so forth could be helped a little bit if we use more distributed generation, local generation. Hurricane Sandy, for example, you know, solar panels were there, but they were connected to the grid. They weren't islanded, so they couldn't be used and so forth. As a part of what you're doing, how are you focusing on the role of new technologies and how they can really be transformational to change and solve some of the problems you have?
Thank you, and thank you for reminding me. I should have talked about that. A couple things. This is transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. And so a fair amount of the technologies, like your generation technologies, are out of scope of this particular QER. There are, as you said, the distributed generation technologies that we've looked at, storage technologies, utility scale storage technologies, and some others, and also efficiency, end-use efficiency. And we looked at end-use efficiency and its capacity for infrastructure avoidance. Okay, not we're trying to keep it within scope, and fundamentally, how much infrastructure could you avoid building if you had robust efficiency programs, and so that was one area of focus. Storage. Utility scale storage. We did scenarios with utility scale storage in it. I should have mentioned we had a 2030 time frame in this particular analysis. You just don't see a huge penetration by 2030 of utility scale storage. And so the other thing I would say is we are at the Department of Energy doing the Quadrennial Technology Review as well. And a lot of the issues on technologies that you just asked about will be in the QTR. I don't know what, I think they're kind of a fuzzy deadline of June of this year that the QTR would be out. And we have been coordinating our efforts here with the efforts there. But the TS&D infrastructure is not heavily technology-focused area. We have where it's appropriate, and within scope, we've looked at those. So, and great potential. As I said, it's the jurisdictional issues that I think are keeping us from maximizing the value of some of those. We need standard methods of valuing a lot of the value that you get out of efficiency technologies, for example, and distributed generation. And so we've looked at those too. So.
Ma'am in the back. And also, if you could just introduce yourself as well, please.
I'm Valerie Volkovici with Reuters News Agency. I was wondering what, you mentioned rail, but what were some of the more surprising things that you learned over the course of this exercise? And how will we see, some of the key findings kind of translated into, policy recommendations or future regulatory changes?
I actually think that rail, the impacts of rail and the amount, it's the shared infrastructures, okay, that I think that, and had we gone the kind of the stovepiped liquid fuels, natural gas and electricity, that some of the shared infrastructure analysis would have been lost. And we did baselines that way with electricity and liquid fuels and natural gas. We did our baseline information, and those will be appendices to the QER. So we did that analysis, but we looked at it all and wanted to understand where new issues, as you describe, existed, and where increased energy supplies and decreased demand had perturbed those kind of discrete physical infrastructures. And in my view, I think that the biggest insight, and I don't want to say surprise, but insight that we got was in the shared infrastructure area, and how important that is to our energy systems in general, and our competitiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And so shared infrastructure is certainly an area. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I've been doing SPR for I don't know, 25 years when I was on the Hill too, and the change in global oil markets since the statutes for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve were written in 1974. And in 1974, the Texas Railroad Commission was controlling oil prices in the U.S. And we were not participants in a truly global oil market at that time. And so the change in global oil markets has enormous implications, both for something like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and for the geopolitical infrastructures that support our shared action, collective actions with the IEA countries, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was another area that I think is of interest and where I think we need to do some serious modernization. And then finally, the impacts of the increases in severe weather events. That the exacerbated by or caused by climate change. You saw what happened in California yesterday. That drought has enormous impacts on all sorts of energy infrastructure and electricity, in particular, reduced hydro coming from both in California and in the Northwest, and enormous implications in the Gulf of Mexico. And how do we harden and modernize our energy infrastructures at the same time? We need to do that. So,
great. We have time for one question. Yeah, sir.
Nils Malsker from American Council on Renewable Energy. I'd just like to ask, what do you think is the most effective way to build some bipartisan support for the maintenance investment that you're identifying as being required? Is it talking about the increase in severe weather and how that might affect it, or is it talking about how lack of investment would stifle economic growth?
I really think that these are not partisan issues, and there have been many instances in our history where support for infrastructure has made a huge difference in the country. I think most recently the internet. That federal support was in the Defense Department. Look at what that has done. That was I think, I don't want to say serendipitous, but that was not a particular focus on infrastructure. It just ended up being huge. But the interstate highway system had a major impact on how we move goods and services around the country. Electrification of rural America, the scientists all say that is one of the supreme achievement of the 20th century. That was a concerted national effort priority to do that. Water in the West. We wouldn't have a lot of those large cities in the West if we didn't have support for federal water systems out there. And looking at the QER and going back and looking at some of the major federal national priority efforts for infrastructure, what I found is the first loan guarantee program was for the railroads. After the Civil War, there was a huge fighting over whether it was a federal role for infrastructure prior to that. But then we gave land grants to the railroads in spite of the fact that the Congress didn't want to give money to them, and then we started giving loan guarantees. So long history of support for infrastructure that has changed the face of the country, and I think that this infrastructure affects everything from our energy security to our competitiveness to our environment, and those are all national priorities. So.
Well, Melanie, thank you so much for coming and taking the time out of what is clearly a very busy
Great,
day
thank
for you.
You. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Let me just say that we have 4 or 5 events coming up over the next few weeks with the Global Energy Center. On Monday at 12:30, for those of you who want a free lunch, Steve Levine is going to be here talking about his book on battery storage and his thoughts on that, along with Jeffrey Chamberlain from the Argonne National Laboratory, who's one of the true experts in this area. We also have coming up a program next week, a program on the North-South energy connection in Eastern Europe, a program on Mexican energy reform. That's on the the 8th. It's on our web. It'll be on the website. We also coming up a program on Europe on April 21st on the European Energy Union, European laws and regulations, the third energy package, and competition rules and their effect. And we have our new technology series on the future of renewables on the 24th, and I could go on, but keep track of us on our website, because we have a lot of you will be getting invitations, but you can keep track that way. We have many events coming up. So thank you, Melanie, for a wonderful presentation, and even though you couldn't specifically say what the QER was going to be, I think reading between the lines we can get a pretty good idea of what might be coming, and maybe when it's out,
Hopefully we'll surprise you.
well, we'll see what the surprises are, and maybe we'll get you back after that. So thank you very much, everybody.